from the they benefited from the Anania Kavod, from the clouds of glory that protected and covered the Jewish people, that served as dwelling places for the Jewish people. So why is it that women are exempt from the mitzvah of sukkah? So Tosfos in Psachim says that Afhenu Yubosa Hades, requiring women in mitzvos that commemorate miracles that they benefited from, is only a drabanan halacha. It is a law that only applies rabbinically. Since it only applies rabbinically, Chachamim only applied it to rabbinic mitzvos. They did not apply it to mitzvos d'oraisa, to biblical mitzvos. Consequently, since the mitzvah of the mitzvah of sukkah is mentioned in the Chumash, since the mitzvah of sukkah is mentioned in the Chumash, so the Chachamim did not apply the halacha of Afheino Yibos Hanes. Toward the end, I will try to explain that. But it's interesting that Tosfos in Megillah, he asks a similar question, but he has an altogether different opinion. Tosfos Megillah asked the question: we know that women are required to eat matzah. So on Pesach, why are women required to eat matzah on Pesach? Women are required to eat matzah on Pesach because the halacha is that whoever is prohibited from eating chametz is required in the mitzvah matzah. It's a special xeris hakasuf. So because of that, women are required to eat matzah. So Tosfos asked the question, why do we need a special xeris hakasuf?
So
why don't we say Afheinu Yubos Hanes? And since Afheinu Yubos Hanes, we don't need a special pasuk to tell us that women are required in matzah. So Tosfos says Afheinu Yubos Hanes is only derabbanan, is only rabbinic, and consequently they will only be required on the basis of Afheinu Yubos Hanes in the mitzvah of matzah rabbinically, but biblically, mid'oraisa, they would not be required in the mitzvah of matzah. So there's a dispute between Tosfos and Psachim and Tosfos and Megillah. Tosfos and Psachim says that a biblical mitzvah, women are not required, not on the d'oraisa level, not on a biblical level, and not on a rabbinic level. But Tosfos in Megillah says that Afheinu Yubos Hanes midrabbanan will apply even to biblical mitzvahs. Now, however, that my grandfather, he suggested an altogether different answer to the question. In other words, we asked the question, why doesn't the mitzvah of the din of Afheinu Yubos Hanes, that all those who benefited from a miracle are required in the mitzvahs that are associated to that miracle, apply to the mitzvah of matzah? Why doesn't it apply to the mitzvah of sukkah? My grandfather said, and he brought, with this, he answered another question, because we know that there is a mitzvah of tefillin. And the mitzvah of tefillin, the Torah tells us, Laman tiyeh Torah Hashem beficha. It's in order that Laman tiyeh Torah Hashem beficha, ki biyad chazaka hotziacha miMitzrayim, because God took you out of the land of Egypt. So, in other words, the mitzvah of tefillin is associated with the Exodus. So the question is, why aren't women required, at least rabbinically, to put on tefillin? So my grandfather said that the mitzvah of tefillin and the mitzvah of tefillin, as well as the mitzvah of matzah, as well as the mitzvah of sukkah. Yes, the reason for those mitzvahs is Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the exodus from Egypt. However, knowledge of the exodus is not a prerequisite to fulfill that mitzvah. In other words, if somebody will sit in sukkah and he will not know about the exodus, he'll know there is a mitzvah to eat in sukkah, so he's sitting in sukkah and eating in sukkah. Or he will eat matzah, and he'll know that there is a mitzvah of eating matzah. But he will not know about the miracle that took place about the dough, that the Jewish people left Egypt in such a rush that the dough didn't have time to rise. Or if a person will sit in sukkah and not know that the Jewish people sat in sukkos during the process of the exodus from Egypt when they were in the desert going to Eretz Yisrael, still they will fulfill the mitzvah, even though that's the reason for the mitzvah. But sometimes, in fact, most of the time, the reasons for the mitzvah are in the background of the mitzvah. However, in a few situations, the reason for the mitzvah is part and parcel of the mitzvah. And if one has no knowledge of why we're performing these mitzvahs, then he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. Let's say if somebody will light Hanukkah candles and have no idea about the miracle of the Chashmonayim, or let's say somebody will read the Megillah and not be aware about the miracle that happened in Persia with the Jewish people. It doesn't mean they have to know every detail, but they have to have some knowledge of it. So then they will not perform the mitzvah. Why? Because there are certain mitzvahs with the reason for the mitzvah. Knowledge of the reason is a prerequisite for the performance of the mitzvahs. And there are certain mitzvahs where the reason for the mitzvah is only in the background of the mitzvah and is not a prerequisite for the fulfillment of the mitzvah. So my grandfather said, when do we say Yapein Hayubo Sahanes? When do we say women are required in mitzvos that they benefited for the event that the mitzvah commemorates? That's only in regard to mitzvos where the reason for the mitzvah, where knowledge of the miracle is essential to the performance of the mitzvah. So there, women would be required. My grandfather said, in Sukkah, of course, it's a good thing to know why we're sitting in Sukkah, besides the fact that it's a mitzvah. And it's a good thing to know why we're eating matzah. But nevertheless, you will fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. You will fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah, even if you don't have knowledge about it. And so consequently, women, Apena Yubos Nes doesn't apply. It's only a mitzvah pursuminisa where there's knowledge or the giving over of knowledge involved in the mitzvah. Now, and the same thing is true about the mitzvah of tefillin. Because the mitzvah of tefillin, sure, Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Torah says that ki v'chozek yorotzi ki v'yad chazak kahotziach mitzrayim. That's true, but knowledge of the Exodus is not a prerequisite for the fulfillment of the mitzvah of tefillin. Now, this raises some problems, though, because there is a machlokes between the Bach and the Beis Yosef regarding the mitzvah of tefillin. The question is, does one have to be aware, now again, not of every detail, but does a person have to have a rough understanding in order to perform the mitzvah of tefillin, to know what the parshios in the tefillin talk about? In other words, we have two parshios that talk about the Exodus, Kadesh and V'haya K'biyacha. And we have two parshios in the tefillin that talk about Kabbalah Sol Malchus Shemayim, accepting the yoke of heaven, Shema and V'hayim Shemoah. So is knowledge of the mitzvah, is knowledge of what topics the parshios in the tefillin talk about, part of the mitzvah of tefillin, or it's not a requirement in the mitzvah of tefillin. So I think the Beis Yosef sheet is it's not a requirement, and the Bach sheet I think is that it is a requirement. So if we say it's not a requirement, so my grandfather's answer is very simple. A person could fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin without any knowledge about the Exodus. However, if we say that you have to know what the parshios talk about, and two of the parshios, two parshios in the tefillin talk about the Exodus, so hadra kushil leduchei. Why is it that the mitzvah of tefillin is not considered a mitzvah pursuing Isa, and consequently women should be required in the mitzvah of tefillin? Now, there was an interesting machlokes that took place not so long ago. I'm 74 years old, so my perspective of not so long ago remains the same. This argument took place probably, 50, 60 years ago, 50 years ago. And I was first told about this argument that took place. When I say an argument, I mean in a very respectful manner. I don't mean argument in the sense of bitterness or that. I was told about it by Rav Herschel Berger, one of the Rabbanim in the Chicago area. He told me that there was a dispute between Hagon Reb Yitzchak Kutner and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Zatzal, both of them, Zatzal, about the mitzvah of tefillin. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, after the 6-Day War, he instituted this. He encouraged some of his Hasidim to go around and put tefillin on people, and to a certain extent, putting the halacha aside. To a certain extent, that was the first experience that many people had in putting on tefillin, in doing certain mitzvos, and for certain people, it put them on the road to tshuva. But from a halachic perspective, Rav Hutner felt that if people are not aware that there are 4 parshios in the tefillin, they think it's just a box that you put on, that the halacha requires you to put on. You do not fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin. And he actually went down to Crown Heights, I'm told. One evening he went to Crown Heights because him and the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the 40s and the early 50s, they were very, very close. Of course, once the Lubavitcher Rebbe became Rebbe, he was so involved in his activities, he hardly left his office. And I assume that he couldn't have been very much involved in joint activities, personal activities. But it could be that Rav Hutner also felt that putting on tefillin where one would not fulfill the mitzvah tefillin, he might have felt that it's not proper covered for the tefillin. That I don't know. So he went down to Crown Heights to speak to Lubavitcher Rebbe about it. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe disagreed with Rav Hutner, and he felt that there is something halachically accomplished by the putting on of tefillin, even if a person isn't aware there are partials. Rav Hutner felt that even according to the Shita, that you don't need to know about what the partials talk about, but you had to be aware that there are partials in the tefillin. It's not just the box. And the Rebbe felt that even according to the opinion that you have to know even according to the opinion that you have to know what the partials talk about, he didn't mean every detail, but about Yitzias Mitzrayim, about Kabbalah Sol Malchus Shemayim. He said, even according to those shitas, that's only lechatchila. Could be lechatchila midyaraisa. But even without that knowledge, and even without the knowledge that there are 4 partios in the tefillin, you are fulfilling the basic mitzvah of tefillin. And consequently, he felt reaching out to those people who otherwise wouldn't put on tefillin, it is the proper thing to put on, to encourage them to put on tefillin, even though they don't know what's behind the tefillin and what's inside the tefillin. Now, according to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, that it's only lechatchila, we could suggest, or it could be understood in one of 2 ways. What I think is, what was the argument between Rav Hutner and the Lubavitcher Rebbe at that time when Rav Herschel Berger told me about the disagreement between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Yitzchak Hutner. So I suggested to him that the machlokis was on this point, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe felt the mitzvah of tefillin was a mitzvah of putting on tefillin. In order that it be kosher tefillin, it needs specific 4 partios in the tefillin. But just like you don't have to know every detail that is involved, that is necessary for the making of kosher tefillin in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you fulfill the basic mitzvah of tefillin, even if you're not aware there are partios in the tefillin. Whereas the Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin, Rav Yitzchak Hutner Zatzal, he felt that the basic mitzvah is not a mitzvah of tefillin. The basic mitzvah is a mitzvah of putting the partios on, as is the simple pshat of the pasuk. But you can't just put the partios on your hand and on your head. So the partios have to be put using tefillin. But the basic mitzvah is putting the partios on. So that's what I suggested. Now, recently, when I say recently, I assume in the last 2-3 years, Lubavitch published in a separate kuntras, in a separate booklet, the letters that that went back and forth between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and Rav Yitzchak Hutner Zatzal on this issue. Apparently, after the visit, they continued discussing the issue between them. And I saw that the suggestion that I made was they more or less say it explicitly, that was the argument that was between them. But in order to understand what the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, we could suggest that there are two ways to understand it. One is that there is a basic mitzvah tefillin, and the fact that there are parshios in them, that to have knowledge that there are parshios in them, or to have or to know, according to some opinions, what the parshios talk about, is a separate mitzvah that takes effect when you put on the tefillin. But if you're not required in the mitzvah of putting on tefillin, then you wouldn't be required in this mitzvah also. So that's one explanation we can make. And then we could suggest that no, it's all part of one mitzvah. But sometimes we have a lechatchila, the preferred way of doing the mitzvah, and the non-preferred way of doing the mitzvah. And we could suggest, even according to that pshat, that in order to be a mitzvah of Pesumei Nisa, of making the miracle known, that is fulfilled by having knowledge or giving over knowledge about the miracle, so it has to be ma'akev. It has to be a prerequisite to fulfill the mitzvah. And even if you will have a partial fulfillment of the mitzvah without that knowledge, it will not be considered from the mitzvahs of Pesumei Nisa that we could say Atein Hayubo Sahanes. So if we say, like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, we could understand why we don't say Atein Hayubo Sahanes in regard to the mitzvah of tefillin, even according to those who say that you have to have knowledge of what the parsha discusses. Now, however, if we say, like Rav Yitzchak Hutner, I think there is another reason why we could say that the mitzvah of tefillin is not a mitzvah of Pesumei Nisa. I think the reason we could say it's not a mitzvah of Pesumei Nisa, because Pesumei Nisa is not accomplished just with knowledge of the miracle. Pesumei Nisa requires a re-experiencing of some sort. Tefillin, perhaps you have to know about the parshios, and perhaps you have to know about what the parshios contain. But that isn't an act of re-experiencing Yetzias Mitzrayim, of re-experiencing Yetzias Mitzrayim. Whereas all these other mitzvos could be understood as a form of re-experiencing the Exodus from Egypt. Even, let's say, the Megillah, Esther sent out Megillahs to all the Jewish people, and at that time they read the Megillah. Suda, Purim Suda, was essential to the miracle. The mitzvah. If we say that the Hanukkah candles, the miracle of the lighting of the candles is also, to a certain degree, re-experiencing the miracle. But tefillin in no way is re-experiencing the miracle. Since it's not re-experiencing the miracle, it's not considered a mitzvah of Pesumei Nisa. That's how we could explain it. Now, but the question is about Tosfos and Psachim. Tosfos and Psachim says that we don't say Afheina Yubo Sahanes, even though if it's the Rabbanan regarding a mitzvah d'oraisa. He says, therefore, women are not required in Sukkah because we don't apply it to a mitzvah d'oraisa. We don't apply it to a mitzvah d'oraisa even on a rabbinic level. So therefore, women aren't even required rabbinically to go into Sukkah. So the question is, why if it's a rabbinic requirement, apen yubos anes, that in a mitzvah that commemorates the mitzvah that commemorates miracles that women benefited from, that they are required in those mitzvahs. So why shouldn't a woman be required in the mitzvah of Sukkah? After all, the Anane HaKavod covered her just like it covered the men also. So why shouldn't a woman be required in the mitzvah of Sukkah, at least on a rabbinic level? Why is it that the Chachamim did not make biblical mitzvahs a requirement rabbinically on women where those miracles commemorate a miracle that women benefited from? And I think the answer is that the two answers very quickly. One answer is, what is the idea of Afheinu Yibosanes? We have to understand it both halachically and hashkafa, and it's really the same answer. I think the idea of Afheinu Yibosanes is when we have a mitzvah that commemorates a miracle that was a salvation for all the Jewish people, we demonstrate that it was a salvation not just for one group of Jews, but it was a salvation for all the Jewish people. And we demonstrate it by showing that men and women have the same obligation to commemorate that miracle. And if only men will be required on a d'oraisa level, on a biblical level, and women will only be required on a rabbinical level, not on a biblical level, that won't show. It won't show that the same miracle happened to both of them, that they have the same obligation. So when women observe these mitzvos, the mitzvos of that that they benefited from the miracle, we're demonstrating that those miracles, because that they celebrate it with the same mitzvah that men do, we show that miracle that affected both of them. And then a second reason, I think, to be understood with something that Reb Chayim said. The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim says that that it gives a very strange reason. He's attacked by even many of the rationalists, the Abarbanel. He's attacked by the Abarbanel for this very severely. He says, what's the reason for the mitzvah of kashrus? He explains many of the laws of kashrus on the basis of health. I'm not sure salting meat would be understood that way, but okay. So he explains that on the basis of health. And the question is in the basis of health, how can we say such a thing? So Reb Chaim said a very interesting thought, and this was Reb Chaim's attitude in general. Reb Chaim said that most of the Tamei mitzvos, especially where the mitzvah coincides with nature, with the way the world was created. Many of the mitzvos fulfill a certain function. He says it's not that that was the reason for the mitzvah. He says it's the very opposite. He said that the Zohar and the Medrash says, Istakel b'taraso baro lomo. God looked at the Torah and created the world. In other words, the Torah was the blueprint for the creation of the world. So if kashrus coincides with what is considered healthy for a human being, it's not that that's the reason the mitzvah was given. That's the reason certain foods were made healthy and certain foods were not made healthy. That's how Reb Chayim understood it. What's the idea? The idea is that the mitzvahs were given as commandments. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu, knowing the impact and the effect that the mitzvahs will have, created the world in a particular manner. But the mitzvahs are submission to the rule of God. It's not a question, is it good for us or it's not good for us? As the Rambam says, there's a difference, I don't want to go into it now. There's a difference, emes v'sheker, true and false, and good and bad. When we think about mitzvos, tamei mitzvos is a question of good and bad. But when we think about doing the mitzvos, we have to do the mitzvahs because we have to do them, because we were commanded by God. And so I think perhaps that's the reason why by mitzvahs, but that's true. So by mitzvahs d'oraisa, let's say to commemorate Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, that commemorate the Jewish people going through the midbar, going through the desert. So the miracle is not, the mitzvah is not because of the miracle. In truth, it's the very reverse. The miracle took place in order to give special meaning to the mitzvah. But regarding rabbinic mitzvahs, we could say no. When it comes to Hanukkah, when it comes to Purim, we could say the reason the Chachamim, the mitzvahs that were instituted by the Chachamim, those mitzvahs were established. Those mitzvahs were established because of the miracle. When do we say Atein Hayubo Sahanes? Only in mitzvahs the Rabbanan, according to Tosas Musafim, because only those mitzvahs were established because of the miracle. The mitzvahs d'oraisa, the events took place because of the mitzvahs. There's a famous the Beis Halevi. The Beis Halevi says, when a person says that Bavur Zeh Hashem Livit Seisi Mitzrayim, because of this matzah, God took me out of the land of Egypt. He's not talking about the matzah that the Jewish people ate in Egypt. He's talking about the mitzvah of today, the matzah of today. In other words, it's the mitzvah that caused, the future mitzvah that caused the Exodus. But that's on a d'oraisa level. That's on the mitzvahs that are biblical. On a rabbinic level, we have to say that it's the events that caused the mitzvah. Afhein hayubo sanes. They were involved in the miracle. Consequently, since they were involved in the miracle, they're chayiv in the mitzvahs regarding the miracle, that identify with the miracle. That only applies to mitzvahs that are there because of the nes, not when it's in the reverse. And I want just to say a couple things about my father. It's known that my father was really the first one, I would say, the first one post-World War II to observe. Well, I understand that my grandmother also, my father's mother also, observed Yashin. And what in Europe, the rabbinic families, many of the rabbinic families observed Yashin. And most of most of the Balabatim did not observe Yashin. Certainly in the Lithuanian community, it's well known that the Chayim, Chaim's son, writes in the biography how careful his father was about the observance of Yashin. So but in America, when people came over from Europe, even the rabbinic families, the families that were very careful, did not observe Yashin. Why? Because in those days, the United States used to store wheat. And when my father took over the Hechsher and Streitz, he went to the mill the first year. He went to check out the mill. And he found out that they had just started. They changed the policy and they were starting to use, this was probably 1956, 57. They were just starting to use new wheat. Until that point, they believed, and it could be it's still true, that old wheat was better than new wheat. But the way I heard it at that time, they developed certain chemicals. They developed certain chemicals, and as a result of the developing of those chemicals, they were able to use new wheat for making bread. It was just as good as the old wheat. So they did not store. They used wheat that wasn't stored for long periods of time. So my father immediately, at that point, he immediately stopped eating regular bread. Now, matzah in America was always yashin, because matzah has to be made out of winter wheat, and winter wheat almost always in the United States, it's always yashin. So he ate matzah. Then my mother bought a freezer for the next year, and they froze bread, they froze rolls. So we were able to have bread and rolls as well. But my father was the first, almost Echad Haya Avraham Avinu. And not only he was the first, but you can't imagine the criticism that he received for it. And the question is, why are they upset that my father was being machmir? Later on, my father even pushed it a little bit. He would try to encourage people to observe Yashin. He didn't necessarily tell people they have to observe it, but he felt that it was important. But initially, they were critical of him. And even where there was, after he got certain bakeries to observe Yashin, there were certain people, when all the bread was Yashin or the cakes were Yashin, they would ask specifically, I want Chodesh. Pass the Chodesh plate, was the word that they said. They wanted to turn my father's chumrah into a kula. They said it's yura. It's haughtiness to be machmir for that. They came up with all kinds of chumras that probably our ancestors till the time of Matan Torah had never heard of. And when my father was machmir for something that the Shulchan Aruch paskins, that the Rambam paskins, that most Rishonim paskin, that's Yura. That's haughtiness. Eventually, all these people, after their sons went to learn in Eretz Yisrael, and their sons started observing Yashan, all these people started observing Yashan themselves. Somehow it ceased to be a kula and it became a chumrah. But what's the idea? Why is it there was a difference? Because their approach to halacha was different. My father, halacha was submission to the will of God. It was submission to the Torah. It didn't make a difference with identification with a certain group or a non-identification with a certain group. He could be the only one, and he would still observe it. Of course, he wanted others to observe it. And I'm not talking against those who didn't observe it. I'm talking against those that fought him. Or I'm talking against that trait that people employed, fighting him because he observed it. And why did he observe it? After all, everybody else was Mekil at that time. Today, Yashin is widely accepted in the Torah world. If you want to take a look at the cities where there are Yashin bakeries, the cities where there are centers of Torah, they have Yashin bakeries. And the cities where they're not able to, they're not able to. But why is it that time? Because people don't observe halacha necessarily because it's an act of submission to the will of Kadosh Baruch Hu. They see it as identification with a certain group. And my father's attitude as a submission to the will of God, observing mitzvahs, observing Torah as submission to the will of God, is not something that was limited to Yashin. It was true in regard to everything. That was my father. He didn't have to do, he wasn't trying to imitate anybody, and he wasn't trying to be part of a group. He was trying to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, and to do it the way it's understood in his perspective of halacha. Now, but I also want to say, according to the first pshat, the reason the women have to observe the mitzvos, the first pshat was that women are not required in mitzvahs the Yahrzeit because we have to demonstrate. Afeni Bosanes is only where it's a demonstration that the miracle took place for everybody. That's recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu midas harachman. We should know it's not just a question of women and men. It's a question of everybody. In other words, when it comes to a miracle, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings the miracle for everybody. We have to understand that every Jew is important. And one person can't say that I am more important than the other person. Again, you can't say, oh, I'm going to be part of this group. That's a higher level. You have to be in a higher level. It's not that you're part of a group that's on a higher level. It's the attitude that you have to your fellow Jew, to see the connection, the same connection that you have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, your other Jews also have. That's part of this idea, to see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's miracle was for everybody. The salvation was for everybody because everybody is important. All Klal Yisrael is important. And I think everybody knows how my father, when people who did him harm were in trouble, my father, while being sick, went to Washington, D.C. to save them from going to jail. How he pleaded on their behalf in spite of his illness. Why? Because to him, every Jew was important. I think this is the lesson that we can take. A sukkah is a sukkah It has to be for all Klal Yisrael, has to be right for all Klal Yisrael to sit in. And that was my father was dedicated to. He was dedicated to submission to the will of God, seeing Torah as submission to the will of God, not because I want to be part of a group, because I want to be identified. There's certain people, when they're part of one group, they dress one way. When they go with another group, they're dressed another way. No. Why? Because their commitment is one that is based on the group that they want to associate at a particular time. That wasn't my father. That wasn't part of his philosophy. That was not what he gave over to his Talmidim. And the same thing is true in terms of concern for every Jew. Every Jew was important, and to him, every Jew has is connected to Hakadosh Baruch Hu, has a connection to Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Okay.
I can't hear. I can't hear. There's a lot of static.
Are you waiting? Okay. With everybody? Okay, here we go. Okay. Can we lower that a little bit? Because it's confusing me. I'm sorry. I have a hard time hearing myself. Okay, I'll try. Can we maybe knock out the speakers? Okay, fine, great, thank you. Okay, so the mitzvah Hatorah Chamocha is a very difficult mitzvah. And as a matter of fact, according to the Ramban, if you translate it literally, it's an impossible mitzvah. How can you actually love your friend like yourself. And the Rambam says, the Rambam in Chumash points out, it's haflaga, because it's impossible for a person to say to love his friend like he loves himself. And therefore, the Ramban says on Parak Yutes of Sefer Yikra, that what does it mean? In other words, that what you have to do is whatever I want from myself, I should want from my friend. It doesn't mean that I have to love my friend like myself. That's impossible. It's an exaggeration. What telling us is that whatever I want from myself, I want from myself. In other words, so therefore, if let's say, for example, I want to have nachas from the children, I should want my friends to have nachas from the children. I shouldn't be jealous of anybody. If I want my friends, if I want to win, my dream is to win the big lottery ticket. I think it's the Powerball right now. Right, not sure what it's up. I heard it on the news. I won a Powerball. So let's say I didn't win Powerball, but my friend won the Powerball. I should be happy for him. Whatever I want from my friend, myself, watching myself. That is the halacha. That is the halacha of v'haftar kamocha. Want health? I should want health for my friends also. And therefore, if God forbid someone's not healthy, I should feel bad. In other words, it's not you actually have to love your friend like yourself. Just whatever you want for yourself, you should want for your friend. And that will help you avoid the problems of jealousy and other challenges that might come up. That's according to the Rambam. However, the Rambam clearly does not hold that way. The Rambam in Perek Vav of Hilchos Deos, so he points out Allah Gimel, mitzvah al kol adam leov as kol echad v'echad mi Yisrael kegufo. It's a mitzvah on every single person to love every single person, kol echad v'echad mi Yisrael, every Jew, like you love yourself. Shenemar v'ahavta recha kamocha. So according to the Rambam, I actually have to love everyone like I love myself. He doesn't talk about haflaga. He doesn't talk about what I want for myself, what you want for my friend. No. I have to love every Jew like I love myself. So we have to understand the Rambam. How is that possible? It's out of our reach. And then the Rambam goes on. The Rambam says, "Lefichach," and therefore, since you have to love your friend like yourself, tzarech l'saper b'shvacho, you should speak and praise them. The lachos amona, you should be concerned about their money. Kashir huchas almam and atzmo, v'rotzev chavad atzmo. He says, and then he says, someone who is honored by the degradation of its friend does no chelik olam haba. So the question is, why does the Rambam say lefichach? He says, yeah, the mitzvah is to love, and because I love, I have to go out and I have to worry about his money, I have to talk in his praise. What is the Rambam adding? What does Rambam add when it comes to that? So I think in order to understand the Rambam, we have to understand the Yesod that I once heard from my father. I think, and I actually checked the Sefer. I didn't see it in the Sefer, so maybe you heard, maybe didn't hear it. I heard it. I think when I was already out of Chicago, and he goes like this. He says, yes, there's a mitzvah to love every single Jew, according to the Rambam. But the mitzvah to love every single Jew is not the same by every Jew. What does that mean? In other words, yes, if I end up, I was a number of years ago, pre-COVID, so I was in Budapest, and I knew where the shul was, and all of a sudden, I heard someone was using their phone, and they're using Google Maps, and the phone was talking in Hebrew. I said, oh, I know, it's someone Jewish. A lot of Israelis in Budapest, by the way. All right. So what does that mean? So does that mean that I have to go ahead and coming out of here. Okay, well. You're right. All right. So here you go. So I'm usually pretty good. Sorry. Just a second. Yeah, wait a second. Just a second. Hello? Is that better? Is that better? No, what happened was I was muted before. I don't know why I was muted. You turn it off now. I was muted. Is that better? Thank you. Okay, I was muted before. Thank you. Okay, great. Okay.
We lost you after Budapest.
I lost myself too. Okay, can everyone please mute themselves? Okay, so thank you. Please mute yourself. Thank you. So anyway, the point is that the halacha says like this, that there's a halacha when you go ahead and you there's halacha when you go ahead and someone is chayiv misa, you have to choose a pleasant death for them. Bezdin. Why? Because there's no halacha that if I see a Jew, because I'm supposed to love him, there's no halacha like that. Obviously, that halacha only applies to someone who's condemned to death. In other words, not every halacha applies to every single Jew. And my father gave another example. There's halacha that when a person is going to get married, even though they can't hear me. Okay, fine. So should I stop or I should? Okay, fine, great, thank you. Okay, so halacha is that a person is about to get married. So even though it works to send a shliach to Makadesh a woman, Mara says asur lekadish isha ad sheyarena. It's asur for a man to Makadesh his wife until he sees her. Why? Because when a man marries somebody, he has an obligation to feel, to know, however you want to say it, that his wife is pretty, right? And therefore, it could be if he sends a shliach to Makadesh his wife, how does he know he'll think his wife is pretty? And my father's words were, I'm just quoting my father verbatim, that applies to your own wife. But a person has no obligation to feel that his neighbor's wife is pretty. That's what he said. And based on that, my father said that the obligation, it all depends, and therefore there are different obligations you have. In other words, and what it means is, my father explained, that every relation you have, according to the Rambam, it has to be practiced in the most normal way. And what does that mean? What that means is that whatever obligations a person has towards his neighbor, he has to fulfill. Whatever obligations, and therefore whatever feelings the person is supposed to have about his neighbor, he's supposed to fulfill. Whatever feelings the person is supposed to have about their children, they're supposed to feel. Whatever obligation they're supposed to have towards their spouse, they're supposed to feel. Towards their students, towards their teachers, towards their rabbis, towards the bus driver, whatever it is. In other words, there's a certain, let's say, for example, when a person comes out in the morning, he's always on the same bus, and the bus driver is Jewish. You should be able to say hello to them. You have to go ahead when you pass by a shomer. It's very important that you actually take notice of shomer. Just like you would like to be noticed, they want to be noticed also. So the question, and how do you affect that relationship? That you actually have these feelings, because is whatever the word Ava means, to love every single Jew. How do you do it? It's not so easy. You have to work on it. How do you work on it? You have to practice it. So the Rambam says like this. This is the pshat in the Rambam. According to the Rambam says the mitzvah kol adam lehov as kol echad echad miYisrael kegufo. You have to love, and you have to have that emotional relationship, that emotional connection. But obviously, everyone is different. So how do you establish the right relationship, the right love, the right emotions? You have to do certain things in practice. Praise people, or whatever. Some people have a requirement. You have to praise them. Certain people do something else for them. But it's always very important to go ahead and to understand, to develop the relationship with somebody, that you should be able to feel the way you're supposed to feel. Just to give an example. An example from my father. I don't want to say the names, but my father, after he first got married, had an ulcer. Okay, and, an ulcer, and because of that, actually, my father's diet He was very careful his whole life. Actually, say my mother was very careful what she fed my father, as everyone would know. When my father actually had the ulcer, it's hard to understand, and I want to use this terminology, but there was my father referred to this person as a so-called posek in New York that said it's usher for a Jew to give blood. Yeah. What's the svara behind it? Why is it usher for a Jew to give blood? Because the Gemara says akum hachovel be Yisrael. If an akum goes ahead and causes a Jew to bleed, he's chayiv nisa. So if I am a Jew and I go to a technician to take blood, right? So then what's going to happen? What's going to happen is this akum, this non-Jew, is going to make a cut in me, cause me to bleed. He's chayiv nisa. So if I go and I offer to give blood, I'm going to be overlooking the evil of Siddim Michshel. Of course, that's usher. Sounds remarkable. But my father told this to me. Okay, father told this to me. And so, why am I telling you this story? There were two brothers who learned at that time in Chayim, Berlin, and those two brothers, they gave blood. Okay, they gave blood for my father. My father needed a lot. They gave blood for my father, and my father's hakaras hatov that he had for years. Of that was amazing. Just to give one example, one of the brothers who actually lived in Petach Tikva, when my father came to Israel in the very late 60s, I think it was, right? My father took a bus from Yerushalayim to Petach Tikva in order to visit him, all right? Now, by the way, going to Petach Tikva in the late 60s was not as easy as it is today, right? It was a matter of taking a few buses. My father felt he had a certain obligation to go ahead and take a bus to visit this person who gave him blood. Why? Because hakaras tov, there's a certain relationship, and therefore, in order to develop that emotional connection, that's the idea. That is the point. To really think about other people. Now, I'll just mention. Now, I'll try to do this very quickly. The Rambam in Hilchos Avelis. So he says that when a person goes ahead and a person has to mevaker cholim, someone who's sick, has to help a chassan and kala get married, a person has to do nicham avelim. Why? That's part of it. Because why? Because when someone loves somebody else and you have to develop a relationship, you help them, need help, whether it's nicham avelim, whether it's bikur cholim, whether it's masameh chassan mekavidu, you have to do all these things, and it's based on hadar hakamocha. So my father asked the question. The question is, hold on a second. Why is it based on hadar hakamocha? The Gemara in Maseches Gemara in Maseches Bava Metzia says like this. It says when Yisro told Moshe, you should go ahead and you should appoint people to help you, and then Vadatalem, you can be available to guide Glal Yisrael. Vadatalem, the Beis Chayim, Esaderach, Zgmilos Chesed, Bikur Cholim, the whole pasuk is based on different pasuk. That is no. The pasuk is based on Hadar Kamocha. That's the chiyuv. The question is, what's normal? In other words, does that mean that if I see somebody I know, I have to take him out to a steak dinner, or buy him a burger, or take him, go ahead and to take him to let's say to Disney World? I'll come back to that in a second. No, the answer is that you have to do what's normal. If you do what's normal in that relationship, then you'll develop that emotional response. I'll share with you two stories. So when my father was when I was 11 years old, my father was invited to be a scholar in residence, a weekend in California, right? And if I remember the story correctly, it's in my mind. My father was staying by someone's house. He came in on Wednesday evening, and on Thursday morning, he was going to give shiur Thursday night. And Thursday morning after davening, his host said to him, Rabbi Soloveichik, I bought tickets to Disneyland for you and me. Okay. So my father said, thank you. Listen, Disneyland, okay? He says, but I'd rather learn. When he came back to Chicago, he told me the story. And he said to me, if you would have been there, I would have taken you to Disneyland. Okay. Now, by the way, my father had no interest in going to Disneyland, right? But he felt as an obligation to his son, who was 10, 11 years old, he has to go ahead and do that to develop a certain relationship, right? So what does it mean to feel a certain response? What does that mean? That's the idea of that you have to go ahead and you have to do something, because every time you do something, then you'll go ahead and you'll strengthen that connection. But the idea is that you have to do these things, then you'll come to learn to appreciate other people. And I'll just finish off. As I said, it's different with many people. And obviously, what you owe towards your spouse and towards your children and towards your parents and towards your siblings and towards your neighbors and towards your students and towards the people you work with. Everyone is a little different, but a Jew has to love every single Jew. After my father passed away, so a student of mine was making a siyum in Beit Shemesh, at a restaurant in Beit Shemesh, and he asked me to come to the siyum. I was in New Beis Chodesh. So I went to the siyum. I didn't stay for the meal, but there we davened mincha. And at the restaurant, not connected to the siyum at all, was a certain lady came over to me, and she said to me, "Are you Rabbi Ahron Soloveichik's son?" I said, "Yeah." So he says, "I have a story that probably no one in the family knows." I said, "Great, I want to hear it." She said that she said she was I guess a madricha. She was a counselor in Camp Mosheva, Wild Rose, and my father came for a Shabbos to be I guess he was there, I guess also as to give Shurim that Shabbos. And my father was sitting in the yard learning. Those days camps didn't have air conditioning in the bunks. And her bunk, where she was taking care of her girls, was next door. And I was having a very difficult day. The girls were really giving me a hard time. I was stressed out. I was getting annoyed. And of course I was screaming at the girls, and nothing helped, of course, because screaming at girls never helps anyways. And your father got up and walked over to the bushes in between the two bunks. And I was really embarrassed. Oh my gosh, right? And he says, "Excuse me, I'm about to polish my shoes for Shabbos. Do the girls want that I should polish their shoes also?" And I guess in those days, late 60s, early 70s, everyone had the same color shoes. Black or black. And she says, "Girls, do you want the rabbi to polish your shoes?" And all the girls lined up, and my father polished all their shoes. You can't make that story up, by the way, okay? She told it to me. So that's amazing, all right? And it's funny because, at least I never heard the story. I don't know if anyone, and I asked my siblings, no one heard the story. But I was concerned that obviously everyone's different. But when you go ahead and you see, there's obligations you have to, as I said, to family, to neighbors, and then there's obligations to every Jew. And therefore, Hadrach Mocha is that when you see a Jew who's in distress, you have to help them. That's Hadrach Mocha. So the idea is that Hadrach Mocha is that, yes, according to the Rambam, we have to develop that emotional connection for every single Jew. But every Jew is different. And then the Rambam says how you develop it by doing things. You'll go ahead and you'll develop. Just to finish off, there was once I heard a story about a certain person, a singer, and the songs he composed, he sang, came right from the heart, but he didn't have the greatest voice. Okay voice, but it wasn't the best. There was another singer who also produced songs at the same time. Let's say it was a cassette tape or it was a record, and he had a much more pleasant, sweeter voice. But the first singer felt like the second singer wasn't coming from the heart, and it really bothered him that the second singer's songs were more popular because obviously he had a sweeter voice. But it really bothered him. Why are my songs so accepted? And it got to a point once where his own son's bar mitzvah, the musician started singing the second singer's songs. So he goes over to the guy and says, "Got to stop this song right now." He's like, "Well, no, he gets that right." And after the bar mitzvah, he actually felt very bad, like that was very extreme. So what did he do? As the Rambam says, he started complimenting and praising the second singer. In the end, he became very good friends with him. And he started to have a very strong connection. That's how we have to work in Ahavas Yisrael. Ahavas Yisrael is very difficult. It has to be real according to the Rambam. It's not just doing things. It has to be real. Everyone's different on a certain level. But how's it different? By going ahead and really doing things for everybody, speaking in their praise, and going ahead and doing things for them. And I'll just finish off that I always like to tell the story that the shul that I grew up in, it was a very colorful shul, right? And my father talked to everyone, and I still remember one time they used to have a kiddush on Shabbos, and every so often there'd be a cholent. And I remember there was a precinct captain in the shul, tall, skinny guy. He used to call me Shorty. Okay. And I remember one time he went to my father and said, "My father, Soloveichik is the cholent this Shabbos." Now, I don't know if my father ever ate the cholent in the shul. Okay. My father engaged him in conversation about that cholent. I still remember it. The point is that in order to develop the Ava, we have to have the Ishtadlus doing things. When you have the Ishtadlus, Rambam says, then you'll come to the Ava, and according to Rambam, it's very, very real. And if Ufroslein Sukash Lomecha, that Sukkah represents Shalom, the way to come to that Shalom is by being Mechayim Mitzvahs of Avas Yisrael. More than L'simcha, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Yeah.
I want to tell you a story about your friend.
Yeah.
In 1960.
Good to see you.
What show in Chicago?
That's from Sachem, Rabbi Rich's show.
In
Rogers Park? What? It's in Rogers Park? No. That's in Hollywood Park.
In New Jersey, Avenue 1, I think in the summer. I drove to a wedding together with another fellow here in New York. And I asked him a question, which he refused to answer.
Yeah.
But this is the question, and this is the way he answered it. I said, if you are in New York and it's after Shabbos and you make Havdalah, and you get on an airplane and it flies to California and it lands in the Shabbos afternoon, it's an extremely fast plane.
Right.
What is your situation? His response was, if I can quote the words, I have an answer to the question, but since it's not happening now, I will not give it.
Right.
Did you ever hear that from him?
I had this idea that it's something. I think most mindset, by the way, that says in order to pass the Shiloh, it has to be happening.
Okay. Now, over the years, did your father ever talk about it? Okay. My father was your father's teacher in Yeshiva High School.
What's father's name?
Leibowitz. Samuel Leibowitz. Your father was the only one who went to YU in America, and my father taught in the high school. And your father was his student in chemistry.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. He knew chemistry well. So if I help me out when I was in university, you have in your car? Well, no, I'm going to pull. Sorry, Oh, wow.
Eleanor?
Okay. Black beard. What's this?
Okay.
I have here then.
Who is
I
the
gotta
father
go. Sorry.
of Mayor Soloveichik?
That's my nephew.
He's your nephew, your brother.
Yeah.
I told your father all that.
It's a big issue. Just relevant. I don't find it for yourself. I asked your father, I said, how many inches does it have to be long and short? What are the sport lines where they have to be? He said to me, that's not the issue. The issue is presentation. Yeah.
Great man. I'm not trying to.